send an invitation.
We are going to invite Mark to join us.
Hi everyone.
Hello.
Hi everyone, welcome. Hi Etienne.
Hello.
We're waiting for Marco Chac to join. Oh, hi from Singapore. Great.
We are wearing a mask here because you have more than one people in the room. One person.
Mark. How to join one? So we thought about that question and the solution. We draw a little hole here, and with a straw we managed to do that. How do you drink wine with a face mask on? We have to adapt to survive. The question is, where is Mark?
Ah.
Hi. Hi Mark, welcome.
Hi. Hello. Wait, let me get the lighting right.
Okay. We'll wait a few minutes for everybody to have time and join the live. How are you, Mark?
Okay, perfect. Very good, very good. How are you? How are you?
Good, good.
No masks here, since I'm alone, so it's good. But I guess you have to wear them where you are.
Okay, Mark, so in the meantime, I'll introduce the team so everybody can know who they're talking to tonight. So my name is Jeanne Bette, I'm from France, and this is Jenna Yim from Hong Kong. So we're part of the Fico team. We're very happy to host that interview with you tonight. So Fico is a wine importer and distributor in Hong Kong, and we've been very fortunate to represent Chateau Musar wines for more than 20 years in Hong Kong and share those great wines with the wine lovers. Marc is with us tonight. So Marc Auchard, third generation of the Auchard family and owner of Chateau Musar.
Yeah, so thank you, Mark, for being here. First question for you. So can you give us a little bit background of Chateau Musar and Netherlands? Are we talking about old world wine producing country or new world one?
Yeah, well, thank you for organizing this, Jeanne and Jenna. It's a pleasure to be, I guess, doing this live. It's the first time actually I do it, or that we do it at Musar, as far as I know. And it's actually fitting, obviously, to do it in an environment and in circumstances that we're going through today. But at least it's an opportunity to share some information with everybody, and I guess be with the at home but not alone, which is probably the best way to do it. So yes, to talk about Lebanon, maybe in general, why wines in Lebanon. I guess we've had a history of winemaking in the region for around 5,000 to 6,000 years. Our ancestors, the Phoenicians, started producing around 5,500 years, and they were known to produce, but also mostly also to sell the wines, not only to drink them all locally, but eventually to export them, to trade. They had their ships that sailed across the whole Mediterranean, and it's their ability to sell the wines that eventually helped wine spread from, I guess, the Middle East to what is now Europe. Initially, they sold to Egyptians, and then eventually to what would become Greece, and then this is how wine went westwards. So although today we consider that old wine world, the old world of wine is Italy, France, Spain, because they're the ones that have been producing in the last 1,000 and a half years. So in more modern times, You have the new world wines of, I guess, South America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. Where do you fit Lebanon? Definitely not a new world. Although we started producing again some wines like 150 years ago, but given the history that we've had, I think we also don't fit in old world because that's taken up by France and the European countries. So I consider ourselves more ancient world. That's a category I think that applies to us, probably to the whole region of the Middle East, to Georgia, Armenia, eventually also Greece. I would fit in those in the category of what I call ancient wines.
What about Chateau Musar then? How long have you guys been producing wine?
So at Musar, we started in 1930. My grandfather, Gaston Rochard, is the one who founded the winery. At the time, he was not a winemaker, but he had studied in France. And when he came back to Lebanon, at the time, the French were posted in Lebanon. It was part of a mandate, what's called a mandate between the two world wars, where the French helped set up the government locally. And the French army was posted there, and they needed wine. So I think that was the trigger that initiated the creation of the winery. The next big step came when my father, Serge, and my uncle, Ronald, eventually took over the winery in the 60s. The major contribution came from Serge in terms of winemaking. And his decision to actually change a little bit the style or the way things were done prior to his arrival. His approach is really to create wines, or was to create wines that are as clean and as raw as possible, with no intervention, meaning no fining, no filtering, no additives of yeasts for the fermentation, so a natural fermentation process. So really to go towards, I guess, back to nature. And at the time, if you think of the 60s, that was the time when the chemistry of wine was being discovered in France, in Bordeaux. All of the chemistry that was behind wine was starting to be understood, and eventually it led to more control. And so winemakers at the time started to control the processes of what was happening in fermentation, etc. And the approach of Serge was really to go the opposite and to say, okay, no, we're not going to go with all these new technologies. And he stuck to what is effectively natural winemaking. And this is a philosophy that we continue till today.
So that's how people call you, call your late father the ultimate non-interventionist, right?
Yes, yes. So yes, non-interventionist is what we say, and this is actually what my father used to use as a term. In the end, there was actually an article that came out in Australia, I think a year ago, about a journalist who was talking about non-interventionism and basically saying, how could you say it's non-interventionist? Because in a way, you're taking decisions, and it's true that we are taking decisions. You know, what do we plant? Where do we plant? When do we pick? How do we blend? What time? You know, when do you rack, etc. So these are all decisions that you could consider as interventionist, absolutely. But I guess the reason probably my father mentioned or used the word non-interventionist at the time, and we're talking 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, was that he wanted to go against the tide. The whole tide was moving towards intervention, more technology, more industrialization almost, I would say. And the only way was to go the other extreme. And so he basically said no intervention at all. And so that at least highlighted the point. And then obviously there are some decisions we take, but the whole concept of Musar is that we don't add anything that shouldn't be in the wines. It's just really the juice itself. The only thing we add is a bit of sulfur because our wines need to travel nowadays. They're sold around the world, so they need to be stable enough. But even the levels of sulfur that we use are below what is considered, an organic quantity of sulfur for organic wines. So this is how we approach it.
I guess it's kind of difficult to produce wine organic back then, like 30, 40 years ago. But along with that, what are the biggest challenges that the wineries are facing now?
Yeah, I guess we have the same issues as others. We've had, in the past, we've had other issues. Obviously, we've had to deal with the war in Lebanon, 75 to 1991. That was a very long period. We produced almost every year. There's only 1 year actually where we did not produce. But clearly, there were major challenges in terms of getting the grapes from the vineyards to the winery. Because there's a 3-hour truck drive in the middle. And the winery is on the coastline in the Christian area, whereas the vineyards are located in the Bekaa Valley, which was under the control of the Syrians at the time. So obviously that has created a few issues in the mid 70s until early 90s. And the vintages, or each vintage was impacted in some way by that delay in terms of getting the grapes from the winery, from the vineyards to the winery. Today, it's a different environment that we're living in. I think the major issue we've identified or we've been faced with in the last, I'd say almost 10 years is global warming, climate change. It's really impacting us. And I think it's impacting, I guess, all the wineries everywhere in the world. Where global warming means extreme weather patterns, both warmer weather in summer, heat waves, but also we've had frost in April 2-3 years ago. And that also destroyed 50% of the crop. So it's really an impact that's moving weather patterns completely away from what we're used to. And so, yeah, it is having the biggest impact in the way we produce our wines. It means higher sugar levels. It might mean earlier harvesting. Some varietals are more impacted than others. Cinsault, for example, resists better. Our local white grapes resist better to heat. Smaller berries like Cabernet will resist less. So it has a small impact on how we do things. And given that we don't use yeasts for fermentation, obviously it means sometimes fermentation is a bit more difficult. It happens, but it is a bit more difficult.
Okay.
But yeah, we have to deal with it. Adversity has always been, unfortunately, part of how we deal with things at Musar.
Okay, Mark. So, Mark, in Hong Kong, we carry more, like we have a very large range of vintages. We have more than 20 vintages. Do you have any advice for our client to choose vintages? Is there any outstanding vintage at Musar? And can we talk about good year and bad year with Musar?
It's a good question. I don't think we have bad years at Musar. Honestly, if we have bad years, we effectively don't release them. If you take the case of some vintages, we actually never release them. Or we wait until they've reached a point where we consider them really evolved enough and then have come back into the fold in terms of behaving wines. So there's some wines like the 06 vintage that we released after 11 years, whereas usually we release after year 7. 74 vintage we released after 30 years. 84 we released after 30 years. So it's not necessarily that the wines are bad, it's just that, or these specific vintages, that they're just difficult and they need a bit more time to come back. But what we've realized is that, if you give our wines time, they eventually do come back. Now, in terms of the younger vintages, you mentioned, how different they are, or what, how would you analyze them? I guess at Musar, because we have a blend of different varietals, and climate is really changing a lot, there's an impact on every type of varietal. So a certain pattern of heat or cooler weather or more rain or more snow, etc. during the winter will have an impact on a specific varietal. The ones that resist most to heat are Cinsault. The ones that do well in a normal summer without too much heat would be Cabernet. So depending on which varietal does well in a certain year, it will have an impact probably on the end result, as in on the blend. Our blends of the reds, Chateau Red, Chateau Musar Red, is 1/3 Cabernet, 1/3 Carignan, and 1/3 Cinsault. But if the Cabernet, for example, is extremely ripe, but in a proper way with good quantities, then you would end up with a dominance of Cabernet. So those vintages will be closer to maybe a Bordeaux style, or closer to Bordeaux. Still will be Musar, but still will be closer to Bordeaux. A year, so that would be a year like 99 or like 2005 or even 2011 probably is more Cabernet dominant in a way. Other years are more Cinsault dominant, 98, 2008, 2010. And these are more probably lighter, more elegant, will show a bit more age more quickly. But in the sense at Musar, what you want is you want to show age because it means that the wines start to show secondary and tertiary aromas, and the Cinsault component helps that. So then it really depends on what you like as a consumer. Do you prefer more stronger, more strong-bodied vintages or lighter-bodied? And then with Musar, effectively, depending on the year that you choose, you have all the options are open.
Okay, so if I'm born in a year that is not very good for in France, in Bordeaux, in Burgundy, and in other countries, then if I want to buy a vintage of my own year, I have a chance with Chateau Musar and with Port, which is great.
Yes, typically yes. We won't have every single year. I mean, some years we did not produce. So if you look at 76, if you look at 73, 71, depends how old you are. In your case, obviously, it will be younger, and we would have most of the vintages available, obviously. And we keep a library of all of our old wines, so you can go back to 56. We still sell our wines for the reds down to 56, whites down to 54. Because they have this ability to age. So yes, most of the time they are available. They used to be more available in the past. We have less and less stock, so now sometimes you would have typically to come to the winery because we've been sending a bit less of these older vintages out into the outside world, actually.
Mark, do you have any favorite vintage? Maybe yours?
No, actually my vintage is not a good vintage, at Musar at least. It's actually nowhere in the world is it really good. It's actually at Musar, the only vintage that we still have in stock and that we have not released. All of the other vintages that we have produced and where we actually still have the wines are available for sale, except my vintage.
Okay.
But otherwise, yes, most of the wines are typically available.
So no favorite vintage?
So, well, yes, today, so what's important, I think, at Musar is not necessarily the vintage, but the age at which you drink our wines. I think our wines go through 3 phases. The first phase is when the wines are between the date of release, let's say 7 years, and maybe 10 or 12 years. The wines are more about showing fruit, fresh fruit. Literally, the fruit is, you can taste fruit from the tree almost. The second phase is when the wines are between 12 and 15 years, again, depending on the vintage. But that phase is when the wines evolve from fresh fruit aromas and flavors to more cooked fruit, more stewed. So there's more concentration, there's more sweetness, almost like a jam, without the weight of the jam, but actually the taste of the jam, of the cooked fruit. That's phase 2. So that's up to 15 years, let's say. And then 15 and plus, again, depending on the vintages, some get there faster or not. The third phase is when the aromas switch to really tertiary, to earthy flavors. And that every vintage of Musar will get there. Some will get there after 15 years, some 20 years. The more Cabernet vintages will get there later. The more Cinsault vintages will get there earlier. So at 15, a Cinsault vintage will show these tertiary aromas. A Cabernet dominant vintage, like a 99 vintage, for example, or 95, would take a bit longer. And so then it depends on, every consumer. Are you looking more for fresh fruit, for more sweetness that would come with the second phase of the wines, or are you looking for earthy aromas? And then you would have to wait 15 to 20 years.
Okay, thanks.
And for the moment today, I would actually drink the 98. That's my vintage that I really enjoy in the current environment.
Your vintage, your favorite vintage?
The vintage I like, not my vintage.
Not your vintage. Mark, so Chateau Musar keeps their wines a few years before releasing them, which is a bit unusual. So can you tell us a little bit about the latest release vintage this year for Chateau Musar White and Red?
Yeah, so so we release our wines, the reds, Chateau Musar Red, after 7 years, usually. So today or now we're going to be releasing in 2020 the 2013 vintage. 2013 is a vintage that had where the pattern of weather was good, as in we had good snow, good rain, very lush vineyards when we came to spring. So very positive. We were expecting like a fairly good harvest. When we got to the summer, in July and early August, we started to have a heat wave, which impacted more some varietals than others. So we had to actually rush very quickly and harvest with 2 teams instead of 1 team, just because Carignan, Cabernet, we had some Grenache as well, with Syrah and our younger wines. Most of them came to maturity very quickly at the same time. So we had 2 teams effectively harvesting. The only varietal that really did very well that year was Cinsault in terms of a long process before maturity. It weathered very well the heat. And so you ended up with a vintage of 13 that is more probably Cinsault dominant, showing much more elegance, much more lighter colored red berries, a lighter body, but a lot of elegance in this vintage. But this is how it will show today, and this is how it tastes today. Obviously, we'll see how it will evolve, but this is roughly where 2013 is in terms of maturity and power compared to other vintages. So it's a more elegant vintage, I would say. On the whites, 2012 is the Chateau White that we're releasing this year. Classical white, I think we're starting to get a little bit more, I'd say, less variation between the vintages on the whites than we had in the past. And so it is going to be a classical year. 2012 was also a year with a heat wave, but these whites that are harvested very late, usually end of September, early October, were harvested at the usual time with normal maturity. They did not suffer too much of the 2012 heat wave. And so it's a vintage that's actually very classical, Chateau Musar White. Obviously, our whites are not the typical type of white wine, but 2012 shows also elegance because it seems to have weathered very well the weather climate in 2012.
So you're saying that a white wine, you release it 9 years after keeping it in the cellar. So it's only ready 9 years after. So 2012,
yes,
the baby vintage of Chateau Musar White. Can you so
yes.
This is very special and very unusual. Can you tell us a little bit about the grapes in the Chateau Musar White and the style of that wine?
Yes, so the grapes that go into Chateau Musar White are 2 local varietals, Obeide and Marois. These varietals probably existed at the time of the Phoenicians when they were producing wines. They are usually planted in the Bekaa, not in the Bekaa itself, but actually on the mountainsides of the Bekaa. If you look at the geography of Lebanon, you have 2 chains of mountains running north to south, and the vineyards of the whites are usually located on the foothills of the mountains, so above the Bekaa Valley floor, and they're orientated westwards. So you could have them either on the chain of mountains that is close to Syria, or the chain of mountain which is in the middle of Lebanon, also again facing westwards. These are whites that ripen extremely late compared to anything else. We produce a Musar Jeune white of Chardonnay, Viognier, and Vermentino, which is harvested in August. And typically these wines will be at 13, almost 14 degrees of alcohol very quickly. The Chateau Musar White is harvested 2 months later. And Obeide and Marois, because probably they are local varietals, tend to resist very well to heat. When they reach maturity, when we pick them, usually end of September, early October, they're around 12.5 degrees alcohol. And it's maybe that ability to age on the vine before reaching maturity for picking that helps create this complexity that comes with these wines. The process of making them is relatively fast. So within a year, they are bottled. Actually, we ferment in wood, leave them in wood, and then eventually blend. And within a year, they're in a bottle. But then we store them in our cellars for roughly 7-8 years before we release them. And we could release them a bit earlier, but for the moment, we do realize that 1 year difference between releasing at 8 or 9 years or 7 years will have an impact in terms of how open the wines are. So the longer you wait, obviously, the more broader, more complex they are, and less austere. So that's why we wait a bit longer than usual.
So basically, you're saying that you harvest the white varietals in October, so 2 months later. So it's kind of a late harvest. Is the wine sweet, or how is Chateau Musar white?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So they are harvested actually after the reds, even, but they're not sweet. And this is a bit surprising when you actually open a bottle of Musar. I would definitely recommend to open it, decant it, not have it too cold. It should be actually at cellar temperature. Our whites should be served like a red, cellar temperature, decanting if you can. And once they start to open up, and it could take half an hour for them really to start to show, they'll move to aromas of flowers, jasmine, maybe exotic fruit. Whereas if you just open a bottle and it's very cold, you could get acetone. And so as that bottle of Chateau Musar that's still tight at the beginning, clears up and opens up with air, you move maybe from acetone or something that's very, very austere to something that is flowery and, like being in a forest almost. So they need time when they open up. And in terms of palette of flavors, we're talking maybe peach, maybe, but we're talking wines that have a bit more structure on the palate. So there will be, we're not talking crisp wines, we're talking wines a bit more like Rhone, if you had to compare to any other region, in terms of how whites behave. And the more you wait, so if you wait another 5 years or 10 years and drink a white that is 20 years old, you move on from these more exotic fruit or flowers to something that's more around walnuts, honey, aromas that are again more earthy as well, maybe mushrooms. Some vintages, even 97 white, for example, will show on the white, will show aromas of coffee that you typically expect more maybe potentially from a red than from a white. So they build up in terms of complexity with age.
Okay, great. So Marc, Chateau Musar is known for its incredible potential for aging, and many wine lovers love to collect older bottles. Do you have any advice on how to open those very old bottles at home?
Yes, absolutely. Actually, what we do now at Musar is that any bottle of wine that is from 96 and older, and I'm talking about the reds here, will typically be reconditioned at the winery before we release it. Which means, when I say reconditioning, I mean we open the bottle, we taste it, we top it up with wine, add a new cork, and then it gets shipped. And obviously add a new label. So if you want to buy a bottle of, let's say, of 1974 today in Hong Kong, and it comes from our winery in more recent times, you'll have a new label, a new cork. So don't be surprised about that.
So it's not a fake wine.
But the wines, yeah, exactly. The wines are fine. On the contrary, they've been checked effectively by us. Obviously, we're not immune to having a new cork that is corked, but that's unfortunately, that would be unlucky. But otherwise, the wines are perfect. What it means is that for these bottles, you would have no issue opening them. For wines that are, let's say, that are not reconditioned, that are maybe 15, 20, maybe up to 25 years of age before they get reconditioned, I definitely recommend using prongs. Actually, I have ones here. So for those who don't know, these are the prongs that you use to open bottles. So take a bottle, insert the prongs. Actually, when you insert the prongs, you're going to wiggle them through. You're not going to push down, otherwise you push the cork down, but you just wiggle them through side by side. Once you're at the bottom, you twist and take it out. If you think the cork is a bit wet and it's likely also to drop, what I recommend is actually two-tier. So you use two instruments. First, you start with your corkscrew. You insert your corkscrew into the bottle. I don't know if you can see it properly here, but let's say you insert it up to here. Then you take your prongs, straddle the corkscrew. Because the screw is already in the cork, it holds it so that when you're pushing down your blades, the cork will not go down into the bottle because the screw is holding it. Once you have these two together, you turn and twist everything out, oops, and you get your cork out. So this is the technique I would recommend. There's actually a video, if you go on YouTube or on our Facebook page of Chateau Musar, or on YouTube, you will find actually 2 videos on how to open all the bottles and also how to decant them. Because when you decant also, Musar does not filter or fine the wines, so you will get sediments that will appear in your wines after 10 to 12 years of age. And so you need to decant them in order to separate the sediments from the wine when you're drinking.
Okay. So other than Chateau Musar, I know you produce other 2 wines. So Musar, Peace, and Musar Gen. Can we call them your second wine? Second label, like you.
Yes. Yes. So here you have, yes, thank you. So you have the Rochard Père-Fils. It's actually, here we see it on the other side. And the Jeune, Musar Jeune is actually, that's our new label that we've just released this year. Exactly. It used to be slightly different. I mean, same style with a slightly different design with this new launch. The wines they're not second wines actually. In a way, when we produce our wines, we keep every varietal separate. So Cabernet, Cinsault, Carignan, Grenache, and Syrah. And when we come to make the blend, we know that the Musar Jeune will be a blend where there's a third of Syrah. All the Syrah will go into the Musar Jeune, and then it will be complemented with Cinsault and Cabernet. For the Rochard Père-Fils, it's Grenache. That's the identifying varietal in that blend, plus Cinsault and Cabernet. And the Chateau is Carignan with Cinsault and Cabernet. And but all of the vats of Cinsault and Cabernet that will be, I guess, dispersed amongst the different wines are when we don't know at the beginning when we harvest exactly which vat will go into which wine. It really depends on the blend, on the year, on the taste. So what it means is that all of the quality of the juice that we produce is the same. It's all at 25 hectoliters per hectare. And the reason then a specific vat goes into a specific or it matches that year's vintage in terms of balance and harmony of the wine. And so really the quality of the juice is the same everywhere. And then Jeune will be mostly unoaked Syrah and Cabernet with 50% of Cinsault. The Cinsault gives it the more elegant and more accessible, less tannic structure that allows the wines to be drunk after 2 years, 2.5 years, which is when we released our Jeune Red. The Rochard Père-Fils is a different wine. It's not, I'd say, a second wine. It's a single vineyard version of the Chateau label. It's an area called Anna, a village, from where we harvest all the different varietals that go into that wine, Grenache, Cabernet, and Cinsault. And so really it's a single vineyard area. We've wanted to create an identity that was specific to that village. And it's a wine that goes into wood, a bit like the Chateau, maybe not as long, but long enough. And so it has more of the features of the Chateau, but with an identity specific to it, to this wine, because of the Grenache component that's unique to the Rochard Père-Fils.
We love it. So what is production like for each year, like for each of the 3 labels?
Sorry, I couldn't hear them.
For the production, for the
Yes.
label, what is the size? Like how many
Ah,
bottles?
how many? Okay. So total production at Musar in a normal year, assuming there's no impact from weather and the last few years have been actually quite impacted. We've been down anywhere from 50% to 20% down. But if we have a normal production, it will be around 600,000 bottles. Half of it would be Musar Jeune. So that's 300,000, around 200,000 of Chateau between the red and the white, and 100,000 or a bit less of the Hochar Périfis. And that's been relatively constant over the years. I mean, again, excluding impact from weather, we haven't really increased or decreased our production. This year we're trying to increase a bit because if we can source more grapes, we would like to take them, because you're never immune to another year or future year with a big downturn in terms of production because of weather. So if there are years where there is good production, we'll take it, and hopefully on average we'll be roughly around the same levels in the future.
And your biggest threat that affects the production would be what? A heat wave?
Will be, yes, climate change in general, again, because the heat waves will definitely have a huge impact on sugar levels, on reduction of quantities. But you know, we've also had frost in April a couple of years ago, as I said, so that had an impact as well. It's just the extreme weather patterns. That's our biggest risk.
And how many hectares of vineyards are we talking about?
We're harvesting now on around, we used to be 180, we're now adding a little bit more, so we'll be around 200,000 hectares of total land on which we source our grapes.
Okay, so other than the three labels, I know you also have the aperitif. All right, can you talk about it with us as well?
Yes, yes.
About Chateau Musar, but not other wines.
Yes, so Arak is a traditional spirit in Lebanon. It is the traditional spirit in Lebanon. The way to produce Arak typically is grapes that are fermented into wine. Wine is then distilled. You distill 2 times, and then the third distillation, you add the third distillation with anise seeds, not essences. Ideally, you want to do it with proper real seeds. And so this will give it this anise flavor. The alcohol will be, or the Arak will be around 53 degrees alcohol. In our case, actually, what we do is we do 4 distillations instead of 3. This 4th distillation allows really the Arak to be much smoother, much silkier. The alcohol we use is around 10 years of age, because we've been accumulating the alcohol and then aging it at the winery. When we do the 4th distillation with the anise seeds, then that Arak goes into amphoras of clay, which are produced locally. There's actually only one producer left of these amphoras, and we hope hopefully that he'll not stop. This passage in amphoras allows the sediments to settle, so it makes it even smoother. And then it's released to the market. And the way you drink Arak is typically 1/3 Arak, 2/3 water, add an ice cube. It will turn white or milky. That's an emulsion created by the oil of the anise. Once you reduce the alcohol by adding the water, this emulsion happens and then it turns white. And that is the traditional drink that we have in Lebanon, usually that is drunk either as an aperitif or actually during lunch or dinner with food.
Okay, so it's a bit similar to all these anise spirits that we can find across the Mediterranean, like the pastis in France or ouzo.
Correct. I think in Lebanon, the restrictions or the conditions or the term of Arak, you need to have 3 distillations. It needs to come from grape juice, not from alcohol, which is industrial alcohol. You need to have anise seeds, not flavorings of anise. So it's all based on actually real alcohol made from you know, proper grape juice. Whereas I don't know exactly the rules that apply in other countries, even if the flavors might be a little bit similar.
Okay. And can we use Arak for cocktails?
Yes, you can definitely. Arak is very strong. It's extremely powerful in flavor, so it will have a large impact on whatever cocktail you make. But it's so you need effectively very little to give it a hint of this anise. There's one cocktail actually that I've tasted in New Orleans called the Sazerac. Sazerac is typically whiskey rye with a spritz of absinthe, and we actually had like a blind tasting of a Sazerac made with absinthe spritz or with Arak. And the one with Arak just seemed to be much smoother with less harshness from the whiskey. And the Arak was so subtle, you couldn't really taste it when you were tasting the drink, but the finale at the end was a little hint of anise. So actually, yeah, there are lots of recipes. You can go on our Facebook page and also on our website. And there are recipes of cocktails that use the Arak. Effectively, you can use it anywhere where you use absinthe, which is also now very popular. Arak is also an alternative.
We want a glass right now. So maybe we can take some followers' question. I saw followers asking what we can pair Musar, like any food pairing that you suggest for Musar or Cantonese dishes, particularly for our Hong Kong followers.
Okay. Yeah, so the pairings, the good thing about Musar is that because our wines are about elegance and not power, they tend to allow space for food, meaning that they will not overwhelm your dishes. And so it allows more pairings with many more things. And this is why eventually you find wines quite a lot in gastronomy, because they will not overshadow food. They'll leave enough space in terms of the flavor profile for food. How would I pair things? For our Chateau wines, I'm an advocate of color of the food, color of the wine. So let me explain. So if you're talking about a food that is lighter in color, or green, or vegetables, I would go for our Chateau Musar white. So poultry, foie gras, fish, but you need, for our Chateau Musar whites, which are a bit obviously more hefty, you need a fish that has quite a bit of taste. White meats, so veal, maybe pork. I would go for Chateau Musar white, because all of this are considered for me as white foods. If you're looking at red food, as in red meat, venison, game, any meat, even veal, but with a red sauce, I would then go for a red wine. And so really, this is how I would do my pairings. We've done so many wine dinners in Hong Kong together. I think the last one that I really enjoyed, the pairing was amazing at the John Anthony restaurant, and we had a chicken, yellow chicken, which was smoked with tea. And then we had that with the Chateau Musar White 2003, which was absolutely stunning. So for whites, also for the reds, again, if your food is more fruit-driven, then you would go for the younger vintage of Musar, whether white or red, depending on obviously what type of food you're having it. If your food is more earthy, more mushroomy, more gamey, etc., then I would go more for the older vintages, because the older vintages, whether white or red, will allow you to reach more of these earthy aromas as well.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so we're going to go through some questions sent in the chat, so don't hesitate to some questions.
Yep.
We'll just you.
I saw people asking for 1977.
Yeah. 852 Taiwan local is holding 77 Musar. I'm not sure red or
Yes.
white. I'm doing red. When do you think
Red.
it might be ready, and what type of meal would you accompany it for the occasion?
Okay. So 77 red, sorry, is a vintage that we used to show a lot at the winery when people would come and taste. So for, I think, 15 years, it was the vintage that we always finished our tasting with. Why? Because it had this ability to change a lot. We started tasting it typically at the bottom of the winery in the cellar. And then that was after like an hour and a half of tasting, we got to the last wine, that was the 77. At the beginning, in the cellar, it would still be tight. And then over the course of maybe 15 minutes, it would evolve completely. So it's a wine that's probably the one that would change the most, or it used to at the time. Today, obviously, it's a wine that's almost for 40 years. 40, yes, 43. Yes. So it's a wine that actually will continue to evolve. So it's a wine that you need to decant. Even our wines that are older need decanting. And it will help them really to open up. I would serve it with venison, with game, with meats. Now but you can also serve it probably with something that doesn't only need to be about meat, because as the wines get older, they become more subtle, more subtle and less maybe intense, and therefore they can take aromas or food pairings that are not as rich as meat. So you can be quite. You have a lot of possibilities with the 77, definitely.
Thanks. And Big Curry is asking, what is your vintage? Mark, you're allowed to have
What is
one joke. Yeah, if you.
My vintage. 68. 68 is my vintage. So that's the vintage that we have at the winery that we do not sell. Acidity is too high. We taste it every 2-3 years. Yes. And acidity is just not coming down. Maybe when I'll be 70, 80, 90 years, then maybe the wine will be ready. We don't know. We'll see. For the moment, we hold on to it. We don't have that many bottles, but we hold on to it and keep our fingers crossed.
Okay, another question from Sommelier Emilio Javier. Would you say that 2010 is earlier drinking, and when is the extreme wave? Heat wave. It's two different questions.
Okay. Yes. So, sorry. And when is the extreme wave? Sorry. What about the?
Two different questions from the same person.
Okay. So 2010. So I didn't understand completely the question, but 2010, yes, is a vintage where we had a heat wave, extreme heat wave. We lost 50% of the crop. Actually, it's a vintage where we released, because the production was so small, we released 2010 and 2011 at the same time, because 10 was not enough to last us for a full year. The heat wave had a huge impact on Cabernet and Carignan. So it's a vintage where Cinsault definitely survived much better than the rest. So it tends to be a vintage with a bit more Cinsault component. Which means ready to drink earlier, a bit less structure, a bit more elegance. 2013 is a bit similar to that 2010, but maybe not as extreme as 2010 in terms of the 10 being very more Cinsault dominated. So that was the first question. The second question was, sorry, what was the heat wave?
The second question was linked to the first one, talking about the heat wave, so you answered to that, so that's great.
Okay.
Perfect. And then Carlo is mentioning is having quite a few issues with the cork crumbling for bottles older than 2001. Any insights here? Any advice?
Yes. So that I come back to what I was mentioning earlier. You need to use these. Now, we use corks that come from the biggest producer from Portugal, the largest, and we use the top quality there, but we do not control, obviously, we cannot control more than that. What happens sometimes is that the corks get stuck to the glass of the bottle. And so when you're extracting it using a regular opener, as you're extracting it, if the cork is stuck to the glass, actually it crumbles. So the only option, or the best option to use, is just use these prongs. They will guarantee that you get your cork out without any issues. Because when you're inserting your two prongs and then you turn, you effectively are dislodging or unstucking the cork from the glass, and then it comes out easily. That is the vintage. Corks are like wine. There are vintages of corks, and they behave in a certain way, and so they are what they are. But the wines are not affected. It's really just an ability to take out the cork properly. Once you've done that, then I'm sure you'll enjoy the wines very, very well.
Okay. And Mark, can you tell us what Musar means? In Chateau Musar, does it mean anything? Why that name?
Yeah. It's so when my grandfather started the winery, he started it in a convent that was owned by a cousin of his, called the Musar convent, M-Z-A-R. Actually, it's like a big castle with a courtyard in the middle, and this is where we were producing in the cellars of that castle. And the castle was called the Musar. When the winery grew after 20 years, 25 years, we then, my grandfather at the time, bought a house next to it and built the new winery, which is where we produce now the wines, around that house, or on top and around it, effectively. So the name Musar comes from the origin of that convent called the Musar.
Okay, thanks. Mark, is there any secret or exciting news you would like to share with us? We all like secrets.
Yes. Secrets, always.
Don't use your judgment.
Yeah, so we're we're working obviously on continuing to produce despite a difficult environment. We have a difficult environment now in the whole world. This is why we're doing this live event. We have a difficult environment, in particular in Lebanon as well, with the economy and a lot of issues that are being dealt with over there. But we're actually now, Musar, at 90 years this year. This is our 90th anniversary, and so we've decided actually to write down that history of Musar, and we're about to release a book that will be released next week in the UK. It will maybe take a bit of time before it makes it to Hong Kong, and I hope that you'll help us at Fico to distribute it in Hong Kong once we're able to actually ship things around the world properly. So actually, I'm going to share with you. I just got the copy yesterday. It arrived from the mail from the UK. This will be released next week, hopefully. So this is a Chateau Musar book. A few pages. Yeah. That's it. Have that allows you to purchase it. It's around 225 pages. It goes through the history of Musar, the philosophy of winemaking. There are tasting notes, new tasting notes for every vintage of the reds. And we asked Jancis Robinson, Michael Broadbent, who did some tastings in the past, Stephen Spurrier and Bartholomew Broadbent to make some tasting notes on all of the wines. Most of the reds and the whites are in there. And these are all new tasting notes, apart from Jancis's, which were from 2018, actually, a year and a half ago. So that's something exciting for us. It's an opportunity to share the stories of Musar with more people, and hopefully get new consumers to try Musar, hopefully after reading the book.
So sorry, Mark, we will get you to sign all the copies in Hong Kong when you come visit us next time, hopefully in September. We'll book in a few hours for that.
In September as my usual trip, and hopefully this time of the year we should be able to travel, I hope, by then.
And Mark, can you tell us a little bit about large formats with Chateau Musar? Like 3 liters, anything bigger?
Yeah, so we started producing 3 liters and 6 liters with the 2010 vintage. So these were released 2 years ago. Then obviously every year we've been producing them now. So 13 will be the same. We'll have some 3 liters and 6 liters. The quantities are small because it's difficult to know how much to produce. I think we need to produce a bit more than we've produced in the past. But because we sell our wines after 7 years, it means that, you know, it takes there's a lag time between realizing how much the demand is and how much we can produce. So whatever we produce now, let's say of the 16 vintage, will be sold in 3 years time or 2 years time. But yes, so 3 liters and 6 liters are available. We've also done some Chateau Magnums of white, Chateau Musar white in Magnums that are also available. And that also started the same vintage, 2010.
Okay. I'm seeing another question from MY Enterprises. How would you describe the philosophy of Chateau Musar in 1 sentence? Well, I'm going to say in 4 words to make it a little bit more challenging. And the 4 words cannot be very, very, very special.
Very, very. Okay. I would say first word I would use is true, as in true wines, no makeup, so real wines. True is probably the first one. The second one I would use is elegant. This is what we strive for. Harmony, balance, and elegance is really what we're looking for. Our wines distinctive, because they have really an identity that is very unique to them. So I think distinctive is probably the right word. And last one would be alive. Wines that change, that evolve, that have the ability to age well and evolve over time in the bottle and also in the glass. So this component of being alive for me is really important because it characterizes a drink. It's a living product.
So if you
hopefully that describes and answers the question.
Right. So for someone, if someone doesn't know anything about Chateau Musar and asks me what is Chateau Musar like, how would you say? Would you say like it's a Bordeaux style wine with like a Middle Eastern soul? Or how would you say, like, very simply?
I think the Middle Eastern soul, definitely. And I think when some people taste our whites, if you taste them after an hour, for example, you would get an aroma of orange blossom, which is this typical syrup that you find in Lebanese desserts. But obviously it has nothing to do with the grapes. It's just, it happens that the grapes from that region, Obaid and Marwah, that we use, create that type of aromas, which is similar to what you get in the food from the Middle East. So that's maybe random. When people taste our reds, they find some spices that for them are reminiscent of what they imagine the Middle East is like. But again, it's we're using varietals that are also existing in France. So maybe the terroir gives that component. Maybe it's our methodology. Maybe the fact that we don't treat the wines in any way helps create that these aromas that are specific to maybe to Musar. I don't know, but they are reminiscent, or at least for many people, they remind them of the Middle East. So yes, a soul of the Middle East is definitely there. Now, in terms of style, we are old world style, definitely. And depending on the vintage, you could have some vintages that are a bit more Bordeaux dominant. Some others are more Rhone dominant if Carignan or Cinsault appears. Some vintages are even more Burgundy-like a 98 or 74. are more burgundy in terms of the structure and the ethereal aspect of the wines. So if you're a sommelier in the US once told me, if I'm blind tasting and